Hi, my name is Robert Merget, and today I'm here to present you a long version of our talk to the Raccoon attack, finding and exploiting most significant bit oracles in TLS-DH. This is a joint research effort with Markus Brinkmann, Nimrod Aviram, Jura Zambrowski, Johannes Mittmann, and Jörg Schwenk. So for this audience, I don't think TLS needs much of an introduction. TLS is probably the most used cryptographic protocol in the world. But let's quickly recap how TLS works. So in TLS, the client initiates the connection and it sends a client hello message, which contains nonces and cryptographic algorithms, which are supported by the client, and the highest supported version from the client to the server. The server then selects the algorithms which are used for the connection and sends a nonce back. When a TLS-Diffie-Hellman cipher suit is selected, which is important for this talk, the server also chooses private key and computes a public key g to the power of b mod p and sends the Diffie-Hellman parameters and the signature to the client. The client then chooses its own private key and computes its own public key g to the power of a, and then both parties can compute a shared secret g to the power of ab. And with that, both parties can also derive a master secret by inserting the shared secret g to the power of ab with the nonces and the label into a pseudo-random function. And if you look at this design, it looks actually perfectly fine. So if you want to prove this, and this has already been proven before, this checks perfectly fine. So this works. But in our Raccoon attack, we will take advantage of two things here, which are usually not modeled in those cryptographic proofs. And that is that in TLS-DHE, the leading 0 bytes of the shared secret that contain all 0 bits are stripped from the shared secret. So if you, by chance, your shared secret g to the power of ab starts with a 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, then this 0 byte is removed before it enters the hash function. And the hash function works on bytes, so only the bytes without the 0 bytes enter the hash function. The other fact we take advantage of is that some servers reuse the ephemeral keys. So intuitively, you would think that if a key is supposed to be ephemeral, that the server is only using that for one connection. But in practice, a lot of servers want to speed up their implementation. So they want to save one exponentiation for every connection. So what they do is they use the same public key for multiple connections. They do this sometimes for an hour, sometimes only for a few minutes. Sometimes they do this till you restart the server. So it depends really on the exact implementation. But this is generally had been like a bad practice, but there was actually no real reason why you shouldn't do this other than some theoretical reasons. So no practical attack was known against servers which do this. But why is this a problem? So the TLS key derivation, which is used in, is based on hash functions. And these hash functions cannot operate in constant time. Why is that? Because their inputs vary in length. And a hash function operates in O of n and not O of 1, which means, as you can imagine, if you hash like a very long file or very long data, it takes much longer when if you only hash a few bytes. And this can create a side channel in the implementation when it hashes a shared secret, which is either starting with a 0 byte and therefore is a little bit shorter, or it has no leading 0 byte and it's a little bit longer. This can create various side channels within the hash function, like the number of compression function invocations, the hash function, if a hash function is invoked at all, or on the padding inside of a hash function. But now I talk about how this creates a problem. So the Raccoon attack is a key recovery attack. And what we do in the Raccoon attack, we have to first observe a Diffie-Hellman handshake. So a client and server should naturally negotiate a Diffie-Hellman cipher suit and perform a Diffie-Hellman connection. Once we have observed such a connection, the attacker can send its own connections to the server, where it uses g to the power of a, which is the client public key, times g to the power of r, where r is a random attacker-chosen number, to the server. The server will then compute g to the power of ab times g to the power of rb as the shared secret. And here g to the power of ab is actually the shared secret of a connection the original client we want to attack had with the server, which we do not know as an attacker. But what we can do is we can compute g to the power of rb, like g to the power of r is an attacker chosen number, r is an attacker chosen number, so the attacker can compute this value. What happens then is this server will then verify the finished message the attacker sends in its handshake. And the thing is, the attacker does not know the shared secret, so he cannot compute a valid finished message. So what he does instead is he just sends some random bytes. And the server who wants to verify these random bytes will notice that these are just random bytes and that it's not a valid encrypted finished message. So he will terminate the connection and respond to the server to the attacker with some alert message. And this is totally expected by the attacker, because what the attacker is actually interested in is measuring the time that the server took to respond to the attacker. So the attacker wants to measure the time of the pseudo-random function, but he also has to measure some other computations. But if this timing measurement is a little bit faster than usual, the attacker can conclude that the shared secret of this g to the power of AB, g to the power of RB started with a 0 byte, while if the computation took a little bit longer, he can compute it did not start with a leading 0 byte. And what the attacker can then do, he can repeat the same process multiple times for different values of R. So he does lots of connections and he measures for all of them if the shared secret started with a 0 byte or not. And once he has enough of these equations, he can construct an instance of a hidden number problem, which is a famous cryptographic problem which was initially discovered and solved by Dan Bonnet and his group. And if you solve the hidden number problem, you can actually compute g to the power of AB. So you actually get the shared secret out of it. And this is quite bad for the server and for the client. So solving this hidden number problem is not very easy. So you need lots of equations. So if you leak 1 byte per connection, which is k equal to 8, this means that you need around 200 equation systems. And around 2.5 hours to compute the shared secret. If you are in a position where you get more leading 0 bits, which might be because you measure the difference between 2 leading 0 bytes and 1 leading 0 bytes, you can use less equations, and you get less computation time, but you will probably need to measure a lot more. And also it depends on the length of Diffie-Hellman parameters. So this was what I was talking about was for 1024 bits. And it might take longer if you have a longer moduli. And the 2048 bits moduli we were not able to solve actually with 8-bit leak. So for those cases we need more bits leaked. So you have to differentiate between 2 leading 0 bytes or 1 leading 0 byte, which is also possible with Raccoon attack, but requires a lot more computations measurements, because obviously 2 leading 0 bytes are less likely to happen than just a single leading 0 byte. So we were not able to solve the case for k equal to 8, so 8 bits solved, but we do not, so it might still be possible, it just means we were not able to do this. From an attacker's point of view, it is now interesting to optimize the side channel. So as I said, the difference is only a single byte or maybe 2 bytes in the different length of a hash function input. So it would be great if we could optimize the side channel so it gets a little bit bigger. So to do this, we have to look at the key derivation functions within TLS. And if we do that, we see that there are 3 different constructions. SSL3, which is the oldest TLS protocol, used a custom function based on SHA-1 and MD5. TLS-1.1 and 1.0 used a pseudo-random function which was based on SHA-1 and MD5 HMAC. And TLS-1.3 used a similar design based on SHA-256 or SHA-384. All these constructions use hash functions internally. And if you look at a hash function, which can be used here, like MD5, SHA-1 or SHA-256 or SHA-384, they all use a Merkle-Damgård-Construction. And with Merkle-Damgård-Construction, what you do is you splice your input into multiples of a block length, and you add padding to your input. And also a length field is added, which marks basically how long the actual input was. And then each block enters a compression function and is then mixed with the next block within the compression function until a final step occurs and a hash is outputted. So if we imagine how this hash function performance looks in this Merkle-Damgård construction, is that it's like a staircase figure. So whenever you need another block, then you will have a spike in the execution time. And the more blocks you add, the more stairs you get on your staircase. So from an attacker's point of view, it is advantageous if the attacker can be right at the staircase. So if like the input is a byte longer, then it's up here, and if the byte is a little bit shorter, it's down here. So this is like the optimal case for the attacker. So looking at MD3, SSL3, there are multiple possibilities for the attacker to get close to this border. So what's happening here is the shared secret is concatenated within MD5 with SHA-1. So the shared secret plus 20 bytes from the SHA-1 output are inside an MD5 computation. So this, depending on the module size, this might already bring you to the block border. And also there are 3 different internal SHA-1 computations. So what's happening here is there's a G to the power of AB, which is the shared secret, which is concatenated with the letter ASCII A, like literally 1 byte A in 0x41, concatenated with a client nonce and server nonce, which are 32 bytes each. And you have 3 different ones. So what you do in the, you concatenate this output with another MD5 SHA-1 computation where you have BB, which is 2 ASCII characters. So it basically adds another byte to this internal SHA-1 computation. So you get another shift, which brings you closer to the staircase. And in the last computation, you do it with CCC, which is also two more bytes, which might also bring you to the staircase. So you got 4 different offsets here, where the shared secret might bring you to the staircase, depending on the module size. For TLS 1.0 and TLS 1.1, you have a pseudo-random function based on HMAC. And what you do is you split the shared secret into 2 halves. And one half enters the MD5 based pseudo-random function, and one enters the SHA-1 based pseudo-random function. And in the end, both outputs are XORed, and this is basically the output of the whole function. If a shared secret is of uneven length, then the byte in the middle is in both halves. Yeah? And this is important because it allows us to find additional offsets for the attacker to reach the staircase. Yeah? But how does this pseudo-random function based on HMAC work? Well, the PMS is entered into HMAC, and the HMAC is computed over the label and the seed and stuff like that. And the pre-master secret is actually the key which is used in the HMAC. Yeah? So how does this look? If the key is greater than the block length of a hash function, then the key has to be hashed before it is used in the HMAC, and it's then padded. So you hash the key and pad the key if it's too big. And if it's smaller, then you just pad the key. And if it's exactly the same size, then you can use the key right away. So in TLS, K is typically 1024 to 2048 bits long. So because your module size is 1024 to 2048. So SHA-1, MD5, and SHA-256 all have 512 bit block length. So in those cases, you're always in the top case where the K is bigger than the block length of a hash function. In SHA-384, K has 1024 bit block length. So here you are sometimes in K, namely if your key is 1024 bit, if your module is 1024 bit long, then you are always under the block length. Okay, so your key is basically hashed, which means that the key is basically input in the hash function directly. So to get back to this to the expected computation time of a hash function, we expect the staircase figure. So what we did is we measured actually how this would look like. And here's an example of Bouncy Castle, and this is SHA-384. And what you see is you can see the staircase figure we expected. But what you can also see that the execution time is slightly rising. So even if you're on a staircase, it's not completely flat. Like there's some slope here, or slowly rising. So what this means is that in an actual SHA-384 implementation, like in this bouncy castle, you could potentially also measure on the slope. So you do not need necessarily to be here at the staircase with your moduli. You can also be here. You just need to measure a very fine side channel. You just need to be very good at measuring time. Here's another image from, I think this is OpenMSL SHA-256. And this kind of surprised us because you can still see the staircase figure, so it's still continuously rising. But what's happening on the stairs is kind of random, like there's some jitter, but does not look completely random. So if you look closely, like also these smaller jitter blocks have some repeating pattern here. And you see that right before staircase is slowly rising. And at each staircase, there is like another spike here. And this was kind of surprising to us. So we were like, okay, what is this? And this is just internals of the OpenMSL implementation. Like OpenMSL has a custom assembly written SHA-256 implementation, which was written to be very fast for most inputs. And very fast it is. But this created some artifacts in the execution time, which you can see here. And these specifically, these bigger ones in the start of each staircase are from the interaction between the update and the finalize function. So what I want to say here is that basically the Raccoon attack works even if you're not on a staircase, if you're just able to measure the time good enough, because the hash function, real-world hash functions just have weird performance characteristics, and they do not have this perfectly flat execution time. They should not have, actually, so it's kind of ridiculous to assume, but yeah, we did that first, so yeah. Okay, and now to the crux of attacker optimization. So if the attacker observed the TLS-102 connection and wants to attack that, he does not actually need to do a TLS-102 connection in its own connection. So what the attacker can do, he can choose the parameters for his own connections where you want to measure the side channel to use the most advantageous one for him. So you can use TLS-102 if that fits better with modulus length. You can use it with TLS-102, or you can use SSL3. Whatever the server offers, the attacker can use to his advantage. So now a quick excursus to measuring time. So the Raccoon attack relies on very precise timing measurements. So if you have like bad timing measurements, the attack does not work because you cannot differentiate those subtle differences. And if you want to do this attack over the network, which is probably the most interesting, you need to be very careful with your design. So if you do this naively in user space, so you just write a program which sends network packets and measures the time, then you introduce a lot of noise. Namely, the kernel can introduce noise, the network card can introduce noise, the transmission introduces noise, and the same is true on the end where the data is received on the server. It can also do the same thing. Like the network card can introduce noise, kernel can introduce noise, and so on. So it's not optimal to do this kind of measurements in user space. So what previously approaches did is they measured in kernel space. So they wrote a custom kernel module or something similar. They gave this module a dedicated CPU kernel and let the CPU process measure constantly the time. And they also did not measure the time with CPU timestamps or stuff like that. Instead, they counted cycles. And because this was more accurate than actually doing it with a built-in timestamps. But for Raccoon attack, we found that this was also not optimal. So what we did instead, we used the network card directly to measure the timestamps. So there is a feature in modern network cards which allows the network card to just add a timestamp to each incoming packet they receive and send, and then you can just use those timestamps directly, and then you only create noise on the network and on the other part, but on your own the noise is really minimized. And what we did is we performed these timing measurements with special timing measurement equipment. So normal network cards have a resolution of like 233 megahertz, and this is not very good, and this is why people previously used some kernel modules, because the timestamps provided by the network card were not good enough. However, there exists a community which builds these special timing measurements network cards, which are actually built for financial transactions or rocket science, clock synchronizations and stuff like that. And they are optimized to provide high quality timestamp, and they do this with a 4 gigahertz special chip on the network card, which is only purpose is to make the most accurate timestamps on those network packets. And those cards are kind of expensive, but from a tech's point of view, they are really the optimal thing to do those timing measurements with. And you can measure timing difference up to 0.25 nanoseconds, so which is like 250 picoseconds, and which is really, really good. So what you can do is you can perform these complex timing attacks, but what we found is there are sometimes easier ways and where you do not need this special network equipment and you do not need to do all this kind of really hard stuff, but you can do something much, much easier. And that is a CVE 2020-2529, which is from the company F5, which produces like TLS acceleration equipment. And F5 Big IP had a bug which caused it to leak leading 0 bytes. So if you send a shared secret and a public key, and the server computes a shared secret which starts with a leading 0 byte, and the finished message is invalid, it sends 2 alert messages. While if the shared secret did not start with a leading 0 byte, but the finished message is invalid, it only sends 1 alert message. So there was actually a bug inside Big IP. We do not know exactly how this bug looked like, but this bug caused it to send either 2 or 1 alert messages in response to our public key. And this is much easier because now you do not need to measure timings at all. You just need to see if you receive 1 alert or 2 alerts, and depending on that, you can decide if a shared secret starts with a leading 0 byte or not. We also found other servers which had similar bugs. We did this with a black box scan of the internet, and in the other cases the bug was not exploitable because the server was not reusing their keys, but these 5 Big IPs were almost all exclusively reusing their ephemeral keys. So as I already said, we call these oracles direct Raccoon, and not all of these direct Raccoon oracles that we found during our scans were deterministic. So they sometimes responded with this 2 alert, 1 alert maybe, or some other response, but sometimes they did not. And we assume that this might be due to some bugs internally. Maybe these leading 0 byte shared secrets mess up with the memory internally, and after a while it crashes, or I don't know. Or it might also be because there's a non-homogeneous deployment. So maybe there are some vulnerable servers deployed and some are not. And it's by chance which server you're talking to when you're doing these scans. And so we had to come up with a technique which also performs well when the server is not deterministic. So what we ended up doing is we performed each shared secret multiple times. So we repeated the same measurement multiple times. And we recorded the connection. When we did a statistical test to determine if the responses we got were significant, dependent on the leading 0 byte or not. So what you would assume is that if it's just by chance that you get a different response from a server, that these by chance responses are equally distributed among all possible test vectors. But if they are not equally distributed, then you know there's something going on. So this is what we did. So we scanned the Alexa top 100,000, and we found that 32% of those servers were supporting DHE cipher suits. So it's still widely supported by the servers. But only 10.9% of those servers reused the ephemeral keys. So I think it was like 3.3% overall or something like that. So if you're using DHE cipher suits on a server, there's a 10% chance that your server is actually vulnerable to a Raccoon attack. And but to be vulnerable to Raccoon attack, it's not enough that the server is supporting the cipher suit. You also have to have a client connection you want to attack, and for that to happen, you have to have a client which is connecting to the server, which is actually using the DHE cipher suit. And on that side, Firefox was the last browser to drop support for DHE in September 2020. We actually reported it to Firefox a little bit earlier, but they were already in the process of deprecating DHE, so we cannot claim that we caused them to deprecate it, but it certainly helped in the deprecation process. And as of now, no major browser is supporting DHE anymore. And during our scans, we found 87 perfect direct oracles, which is like oracles which are deterministic. And of those 87 oracles, 84 were reusing keys. So if you had a perfect direct oracle, which is like the 5 one, then you were also very likely reusing your keys. And we've also found 815 imperfect, meaning non-deterministic oracles. And of those, none were reusing the keys. So there's likely another implementation which has the same bug, but since they are not using the keys, they're not exploitable, and we could not identify which implementation is actually vulnerable for that, or responsible for this. So as a countermeasure to Raccoon attack, there are general lessons to be learned. So one important one is that you should not leak partial information about secret values. So in this case, this was not done on purpose, obviously, but a good design approach to achieve this is to make sure that all your secret values are always of constant size. So that you do not strip leading 0 bytes or something like that, or that you're, by chance, I don't know, but because your iron did something, it's a little bit bigger. It makes it really easy to implement if you do this, because the attacker doesn't need to worry so much about the internal processing of a secret value. For TLS specific, the client should now avoid DHE. So browsers are already doing that, which is great. But if you have some other applications, it's probably smart to switch to elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman or TLS-103. Because Diffie-Hellman and in static Diffie-Hellman, you always reuse the key, so it's always vulnerable. And in Diffie-Hellman ephemeral, you do not know if the server you are connecting to is actually reusing the ephemeral keys or not. So as a client, you are kind of guessing or risking that your data gets stolen. So as a client, it's better to be safe and sorry and just not use Diffie-Hellman anymore. On the server side, you can actually still support the Diffie-Hellman handshake, so this is perfectly fine. But you should not reuse ephemeral keys. So if you just use the key once, then you can at most leak 1 byte, and which is not enough to solve any hidden number problem. So this is fine, but most servers also have options for that in their configuration files, where you can say, oh, explicitly do not reuse ephemeral keys. And the static Diffie-Hellman handshake should not be used by either client or server. So the static Diffie-Hellman handshake is lost. You cannot fix this. So there the public key is in the certificate of the server, and that is always static. So there's no chance to repair that. So how does the Raccoon attack interact with the elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman handshake? So I already said this elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman handshake is probably the way to go. And the reason is that the leading 0 bytes of shared secret in elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman are maintained. So what they do is they compute a shared point, and from that shared point they only use the x coordinate, and they keep the leading 0 bytes of that. So that is great. However, we found that a lot of implementations are not using secure big number libraries. So what they have to do is they have to convert the big number to bytes again, and when they do that, they notice, oh, I had the leading 0 byte stripped, so they have to manually add the leading 0 bytes back in. And this in return creates a sidechain again. So it's a small one again, so maybe it's even smaller than the one from finite field Diffie-Hellman, but it's still a measurable timing side channel. And yeah, this is very common in big number libraries. So there might be microarchitecture sidechannels depending on the implementation and how they do this. But fortunately, the hidden number problem is in this setup, so where you have only the x coordinate of a shared point, you have to use the elliptic curve hidden number problem. And solving this equation system is not possible with current techniques with the leak sizes of 1 to, let's say, maybe 5 bytes. So currently, I think the best known elliptic curve hidden number problem algorithms require like a third of of a leading 0 bytes or of a leading byte. So you need much more bigger leaks to solve it. But I would not feel too safe with this, because this might change in the future. Like the elliptic curve in number problem was not very interesting maybe before, because it was just some theoretical academic thing, and now it's suddenly maybe possible to perform a real attack with that. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of researchers are now very curious if you can actually do this with less leaks. So I would probably not count on that, and already move towards not reusing elliptic curve public keys and TLS, so that you are on the safe side. And actually, this is also what OpenSSL did in response to the Raccoon attack. So they were on, I think since 2016, they were not reusing the finite field Diffie-Hellman public keys anymore. But after our disclosure, they also started not reusing elliptic curve public keys to mitigate potential attacks in the future. So for TLS 103, leading 0 bytes of all shared secrets are maintained. So this is a change by David Benjamin, which was made in draft 13, which proved very useful here, because he hated that there was this mess that sometimes you remove this leading 0 bytes, sometimes you keep it. And also he hates that you have this non-equal size shared secret. So he proposed to change this, and indeed he did. And this makes the TLS-103 only maybe vulnerable to microarchitectural sidechannels, so the same as with the elliptic curves. But at the same time, ephemeral key reuse is not so common in TLS-103. So TLS-103 is probably secure against the Raccoon attack. But there exists actually a variant of TLS-103, which is called eTLS or ETS. And this is a variant created by Etsy. So the problem was that some industry organizations were not so happy that there was no non-perfect forward secure key exchange anymore. So what they did is they basically copied TLS-103 and they said, okay, with this standard, it's okay to reuse the ephemeral keys for multiple connections. And if you do this and you have a microarchitecture side channel, the Raccoon attack suddenly becomes possible against these eTLS or ETS implementations. So I cannot really recommend going that route. But why is there this mess in the first place? So we found the answer to this in an old Mozilla bug tracker. And apparently, like this is 15 years ago, so but apparently, the developers of TLS 1.0 SSL3, so this is actually back in 1996, were all independently implementing SSL3 with stripping of leading 0 bytes, because this was the default behavior of most big number libraries. And the specification of SSL3, which was not an RFC, it was just some design document, did not actually mention how you should do this. So they just said a conventional Diffie-Hellman computation is performed. And what they meant is PKCS3, but PKCS3 is the standard on how to implement Diffie-Hellman. And PKCS3 says keep the leading 0 bytes. But since the SSL3 design document did not mention this, everyone started implementing it with the stripping of leading 0 bytes. And actually, in practice, this does not happen so often. So this only happens like in one of every 200, 250-ish connections. So if you implement one implementation implements it one way and the other implements it another way, they are probably interoperable most of the time, but sometimes the connections break. So at the time this was noticed, they were all already interoperable to each other. So when they defined TLS 1.0 in 1999, they just said, okay, then let's just remove leading 0 bytes also in TLS 1.0 so that we are interoperable with the old SSL3 code and that we do not need to change so much. If you are very familiar with TLS and TLS-DH in the academic field, then you would know that there are actually proofs for TLS. And there are actually two ones, one from Kraftschick et al. For TLS Diffie-Hellman, the static variant, and one for DHE from Tibor Jager et al. And both showed that actually the TLS protocol is safe if you rely on the PRF-ODH assumption. The problem is that they did not model the byte encoding, and that those proofs also did not model timing, and that is not a problem with these proofs specifically, but this is a problem with all our proofs. So none of our proofs actually do this. And the PRF-ODH assumption, which they both relied on, is actually not met by those implementations in practice. So what is the PRF-ODH assumption? The PRF-ODH assumption basically says that the function value PRF g to the power of UVX for a DH key GUV looks random even if given GU and GV, and if seeing related values of PRF-SU, X, and or PRF-T, VX for chosen values ST and X. So basically what this means is that you cannot distinguish if you hashed a specific PRF the specific shared secret or if you PRF the random value. And the thing is, in TLS you can actually distinguish that because random value the real value has this property where if you multiply it, that you suddenly get this this information about leading 0 bytes. Okay, so the Raccoon attack also interacts in other protocols. So we are TLS people, and so we mostly focus our analysis on TLS, but it's actually not very TLS specific. So it can also work perfectly fine in other protocols. And for example, we looked at SSH, and SSH also does strip leading 0 bytes. Fortunately, SSH does not reuse ephemera keys. So the SSH developers are a little bit more paranoid since the servers are on the line, so they do not take these shortcuts. So SSH is probably secure against the Raccoon attack. But your favorite protocol might be not. So we did not look at every cryptographic protocol in existence. So maybe this is a good time for you to check your own protocols if they are in a scenario where they are leading 0 bytes, and if those leading 0 bytes might be exploitable or not. So you can contribute to research here. Okay, to conclude, there's no need to panic. The Raccoon attack is actually very, very hard to exploit. So you have to measure very precise timing, and this is very, very hard in practice. So we could do it in a lab setting with special network equipment, but in the real world, where the attackers may be on the internet or stuff like that, it's really, really hard to pull off because the sidechain is so small. However, if you have these bugs which where you leak the leading 0 byte directly, then it's actually very, very exploitable and very, very dangerous. Also, the Raccoon attack is not TLS specific, as mentioned. You can find the Raccoon attack also in other protocols potentially. So the community has some work to do. And also, what's nice about Raccoon attack is that's actually the first time the hidden number problem is used to attack Diffie-Hellman in a practical protocol sense. Like the hidden number problem was actually first defined or designed to analyze how Diffie-Hellman reacts if you leak leading bytes. But this is the first time this is used in practice to actually attack Diffie-Hellman. Usually it's used to attack ECDSA or DSS or DSA. And this was also very nice. So if you want to find more information on the Raccoon attack, or you want to read the paper, you can find it on raccoonattack.com. And if you want to find out if your servers are actually vulnerable to Raccoon attack or the direct Raccoon attack, we have a TLS scanner. It's also called TLS scanner on the GitHub repo. You can download it, and it checks also the implementation specific variants with these deterministic and non-deterministic side channels. If you have any questions towards me, you can either ask me in the chat or contact me via Twitter or per email. Thanks and have a great day. Bye.